International Day for the Eradication of Poverty is observed on the 17th of October annually. In 1987, on that day, over 100,000 people gathered at the Trocadéro in Paris, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948 to honor the victims of extreme poverty, violence and hunger. So poverty is not solely an economic issue, but rather a multidimensional phenomenon that encompasses a lack of both income and the basic capabilities to live with dignity. Let's speak now to Isobel Frye, who's the director of South Africa's Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, about where South Africa stands in this regard and how we could possibly move towards solutions that will help those in particular who live within that poverty line. Isobel, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time. So South Africa is said to be one of the most unequal societies in the world. Where do we even stand in terms of trying to eradicate poverty?
Good evening, Griselda, and thanks very much for the invitation. Tomorrow is the international commemoration of the International Day of the Eradication of Poverty, as you say. And I think notwithstanding the various other matters that have our national attention, such as the electioneering, it is really important for us to look and see exactly where we are, as you asked. We know, as you prefaced, that South Africa's inequality has us right up amongst the highest in the world. But the question of poverty is something which sadly continues to grow, and it seems to grow without any real concerted success in terms of turning that back. Now, we know the poverty lines, the national poverty lines that were announced by Stats SA earlier this year, that the food poverty line is 624 Rand. Below that, people struggle to have enough food to survive, according to the World Health Organization. And the upper bound poverty line of 1,335 Rand per person per month. And yet, if we go back to the most recent Stats SA figures we had for poverty, we know that a quarter of people, even in 2015, were living below the starvation line, and more than 1 in 2 were living in poverty. So what we see on a daily basis grabbing headlines is the inequality, it's the enclave of elite, and yet the reality for the majority of people, as that last clip that you showed as well in terms of electricity demonstrate, just aren't really visible in terms of what we're trying to do. So the question is, why is this happening, and is there anything that we can do about it? And I think a lot of the discussions by leadership of the country keep on talking about the fact that we need economic growth in order to eradicate poverty. But at SPI, the organization that I head, with the research that we've done, shows that with the levels of unemployment as they are, the trickle down from economic growth to the majority of people just isn't going to happen. So 44% of people, of adults, are not in employment. And if we look at the number of people who are unemployed, we can see that 90% don't have better skills than matric. So there's a huge disconnect between the narrative that the poor are being told by leadership and what's happening on the ground. And I think if we can just pause for a minute and look at the 350 Rand, the Social Relief of Distress COVID grant that's gone out, we've seen how easy people are to get it. And yet even that, Griselda, I mean, 350 Rand is 56% of the food poverty line.
Isobel, I just want to touch a bit, sorry, just let me interject there. When you talk about, there's an opinion piece, I think, that you wrote where you said exactly that, about 90% of the unemployed have no development or developed skills to even persuade a potential employer to hire them. It's not necessarily that they are lazy. How do we change that then to equip people with the necessary skills to even make them attractive within that market?
So, Griselda, that's exactly it. And I think we need to start looking at solutions. I think you will have heard the fact that in the past I've talked about the basic income grant. And that's really because it seems to be the only solution that addresses that precise problem that you've highlighted, which is that where we have a mismatch between people's skills as well as and that which the market looks at, we need to enable people to become their own economic actors. And that's what putting cash in the hands of people demonstrates. We've just seen the success of the 350 Rand. And when I say success, I mean that's sort of marked because it's really not enough to have enough food, and yet people are still using that in order to start their own livelihood. So the arguments that our research puts forward, and in fact we launched a big paper on this, no pun intended, last week, and we'll have 2 more webinars coming in this week, is to show the multiplier and the impact of having a universal basic income grant located at the upper bound poverty line of 1,335 Rand. What we demonstrate in that paper is, firstly, it enables people to make their livelihood where they are.
Yeah.
Rather than have to go and look for jobs that don't exist. And secondly, that within 3 years of the implementation of that, we're looking at a growth forecast of between 5 and 7%, and the creation of between 3.7 and 4.2 million jobs, real jobs. Now, what we're saying to policymakers is that evidence is there. People need a better South Africa, and we're saying let's embrace big for a better South Africa so that in 2022, on the 17th of October, we come back and we reflect on the success of the last year's policy embracing.
Isobel Frye, appreciate your time indeed. A part of that opinion as well, where you mentioned that South Africa is structurally flawed, and those are some of the aspects that need to be dealt with before we can make some headway in dealing with poverty in this country. Isobel Frye, Director of South Africa's Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute.